Hi, my name is Bob Wheeler, and welcome to the Berean Observer, where we search the scriptures daily to see whether or not these things are true. Today, we're living in a very, very secularized kind of a society. We're witnessing in our time declining church attendance. Typically, we have like a 7-day work week where most employers don't recognize any kind of a Sabbath at all and require their employees to work on Sundays or whatever days of worship they may want to observe. We have a thoroughly secularized educational system that doesn't want to acknowledge the existence of a supreme being at all. And then we have younger people that are deconverting in large numbers from the faith, many of them raised in evangelical Christian homes. And now they're sometimes professing atheists. And so then all of that raises a question, what is the whole point of worshiping God in the first place? Why worship God at all when you got so many people saying that we can live our lives fine without Him? Well, I think if we look at Scripture, God Himself presents a very strong argument in favor of it. And look at Isaiah chapter 40 and reading verses 12 through 26. And it says, "Who has measured the waters of the hollow in his hand, measured heaven with a span, and calculated the dust of the earth in a measure, weighed the mountains in scales, and the hills in a balance? Who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, or to his counselor has taught him? With whom did he take counsel, and who instructed him? And who taught him the path of justice? Who taught him knowledge, and showed him the way of understanding? Behold, the nations are as a drop in the bucket, and are counted as the small dust in the scales. Look, he lifts up the isles as a very little thing, and Lebanon is not sufficient to burn, nor is beast sufficient for a burnt offering. All nations before him are as nothing. They are counted by him less than nothing and worthless. To whom then will you liken God? Or what likeness will you compare to him? The workman molds an image. The goldsmith overspreads it with gold, and the silversmith casts silver chains. Whoever is too impoverished for such a contribution chooses a tree that will not rot, and seeks for himself a skillful workman to prepare a carved image that will not totter. Have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is He who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain, and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. He brings the princes to nothing. He makes the judges of the earth useless. Scarcely shall they be planted, scarcely shall they be sown, scarcely shall their stock take root in the earth, when he will also blow on them, and they will wither, and the whirlwind will take them away like stubble. To whom then will you liken me? Or to whom shall I be equal? Says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes on high, and see who has created these things. Who brings out their host by number? He calls them all by name. By the greatness of his might and the strength of his power, no, not one is missing." So what we have there, that's from the New King James Version, and you often find that, basically what he's asserting, first of all, is that God actually exists, and that the order and complexity of the universe point to intelligent design. You get atheists like Timmy Gibson, for example, on his YouTube channel who will swear up and down, there is absolutely no evidence for the existence of God. Nonsense. That is just utter and complete nonsense. You are literally surrounded by evidence for the existence of God. Just go outside and look at the universe which He created. And what we know from just from observation and experience, that order does not spontaneously arise from chaos. Life does not arise spontaneously from not life. So when you look at the universe with all of its complexity and its functionality, there had to have been a designer behind it. I think Timmy Gibson can more easily convince me that nobody designed his car that he drives than he can convince me that God didn't create the universe. And one of the things that's interesting about Mr. Gibson is that he has tattoos. So he'll try to argue that the tattoos on his hand were done by intelligent design, but the hand itself was not. Okay, tell me another one. So yeah, we know that life does not spontaneously arise from non-life. This is just common, everyday, ordinary experience that all of us see every day. And then, as the passage itself points out, the order and complexity of nature far surpasses anything human engineering can create. So Isaiah begins in verse 12 by saying, "Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, measured heaven with a span, calculated the east of the earth in a measure, weighed the mountains in scales, and the hills in a balance?" Now, of course, God didn't use physical instruments necessarily to create the world, but the idea there is that we know that artifacts made by human beings, um, show a certain kind of a structure and reality. And so the implication is that nature itself had to have had an intelligent designer behind it who crafted it according to a plan that he had in his own mind. In his own mind. And then we know that, and in particular, he points to the sheer immensity of it. He talks about the measure, uh, the waters, or the waters of the ocean. He talks about heaven with a span. He talks about the dust of the earth in a measure, and weigh the mountains in a scale, and the hills in a balance. And I think part of the problem is a lot of these modern people live in urban areas, and they're just surrounded by things that were made by human beings, and so it's easy for them to say, "Oh, there's no God." But for those who live out here in the country, and I live in a very rural area in north central Pennsylvania, you just look outside and you're struck by the hills and the mountains and the trees and the valleys and the rivers and the lakes, and you're conscious of the fact that all of this, there's a kind of a grandeur and a majesty to the whole thing that far surpasses anything that human engineering can create. And of course, for an ancient Israelite living in the Near East, they lived close to nature. At night, they'd look up into the sky and they would see the stars above. In the daytime, they'd see the clouds and the sun. And they too were struck by the sheer immensity and the majesty of some of the mountains. And they just take a look at the leaves on a tree and think about the whole process of photosynthesis and everything that makes the whole thing, that makes the combination of factors that makes the tree alive. And then they wonder, yeah, there had to have been a supreme being behind all of this. Yeah, something like this just doesn't come into existence by itself or by accident. And then in verse 22, Isaiah says, "It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain, and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in." So again, you go outside at night and you look into the sky and you look at the distant stars spread all across the heavens, and you ask yourself, this is a work of art, and this is something that we should all be impressed with. That an intelligent supreme being, an all-powerful intelligent supreme being, had to have brought all of this about. Things like this just don't happen by accident. Sorry about that. Then the next thing we ought to know here is that the next point that ought to be made is that not only if God exists, then God should be worshipped. And so we're looking at God's sheer immensity in verses 15 through 17, where Isaiah says, "Behold, the nations are as a drop in a bucket, and are counted as the small dust on the scales. Look, he lifts up the isles as a very little thing, and Lebanon is not sufficient to burn, nor is beast sufficient in the burnt offering. All nations before him are as nothing, and they are counted by him less than nothing and worthless." So in other words, you take a look, basically compared to human life, God is infinitely great, and human beings are just tiny in comparison. The creator of heaven and earth is far greater than some finite mortal human being who's a creature of the dust, and has human dimensions, physical dimensions. And so he talks about natural objects like the islands and the trees of Lebanon, and he says that the God who made that is far greater than the things themselves, even as oppressive as those things may happen to be. And then he says that the nations, by comparison, are nothing. I mean, we take a look at a country like the United States, and with its geographical territory and its population, and it's been around for 250 years. That's nothing compared to an infinite God who's been from all eternity. And nations have come and gone before us. Some of them are very great and impressive, like the Roman Empire, and yet they're all gone. But God still exists. So God is infinitely greater than, the greatest human nations that we can think of. Then he talks about God's intelligence and wisdom in verses 12 through 14, where it says, "Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, measured heaven with a span, and calculated the dust of the earth in a measure, weighed the mountains in the scales and the hills in a balance? Who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, or who has counseled, or as his counsel has taught him? With whom did he take counsel, and who instructed him? And who taught him in the path of justice? Who taught him knowledge, or showed him the way of understanding?" The fact of it is that there is nobody that is anywhere near as wise or as smart, as intelligent as God is. So you take a look at the universe, and with all its complexity, science spends ages and ages trying to understand it and unravel it. I'm always amazed at just the sheer complexity and functionality of the human body, and the fact that a medical student could spend years learning how the thing works and how to repair it when it gets broken and sick. And so the idea here is that no one has intelligence that is superior to God's. There's nobody that could give him advice and tell him what to do. God is the supreme being, and he's ultimately the most intelligent being there is. Then he goes on to talk about God's power and might in verses 22 through 28, where it says, "It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain, and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. He brings the princes to nothing. He makes the judges of the earth useless. Scarcely shall they be planted, scarcely shall they be sown, scarcely shall their stock take root in the earth, when he will also blow on them, and they will wither, and the whirlwind will take them away, and are like stubble." So the idea here then, and then it goes on, "To whom then," and Isaiah asks the question, "to whom then will you liken me? Or to whom shall I be equal, says the Holy One? Lift up your eyes on high, and see who has created these things, who brings out their host by number. He calls them all by name. By the greatness of his might and the strength of his power, not one is missing. Why then do you say, O Jacob, or speak, O Israel, may my way is hidden from the Lord, and my just claim is passed over by God? Have you not known? Have you not heard? The everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, neither faints nor is weary. His understanding is unsearchable." So, in other words, God is of infinite power and of infinite wisdom, and far surpasses any of us. And he goes on in verses 23 and 24, and he tells about how that God ultimately controls human destiny. So it says, "He brings the princes to nothing. He makes the judges of the earth useless. Scarcely shall they be planted, scarcely shall they be sown, scarcely shall their stock take root in the earth, when he will also blow on them, and they will wither, and the whirlwind will take them away like stubble." So in ancient times, so basically what it boils down to is that God ultimately controls human destiny. And you take a look at what's going on in the world today with the Ukraine war and the war in Iran, and you have people like Vladimir Putin, and you've got people like Donald Trump that make plans that think that they're going to accomplish things, and then their plans are frustrated and don't work out the way they wanted to. And the reason, but God is omnipotent, and He ultimately controls everything, and ultimately our destiny is in His hands, and we should bow down and worship Him for that. So he finally winds up concluding in verses 25 and 26. He says, "To whom then will you liken me, or to whom shall I be equal, says the Holy One? Lift up your eyes and lift up your eyes on high and see who has created these things." So in other words, basically nobody can be compared to God, and therefore He's the one who deserves our attention and devotion. And then I think the point has to be made in verses 18 through 20, where it talks about idolatry. The problem is that when we remove God from the picture, we inevitably wind up, as human beings, worshiping something less than God. And back in ancient times, they would carve out idols out of wood and metal, and which is kind of crazy. You're going to bow down and worship something that you made, okay, that is far less, more finite than you are, okay? And in modern times, of course, most modern Westerners won't do such a thing. They'd agree that's pretty foolish. But we typically fill the void with something other than God. I think it was, if you take God out of the picture, why then you typically wind up worshiping the state, or you wind up worshiping the Führer, the dictator, or possibly it might be you're devoting your life to the pursuit of wealth and you worship the stock market, or maybe you're devoted to sports and you worship movie stars and athletes, something like that. But none of those things can even begin to compare to God, who is infinite and eternal and our Creator. We owe our very existence to God, and so He's the one that we ought to be worshiping and adoring. So what it basically all boils down to is that creation itself speaks of the power and the majesty of God. Yes, Mr. Gibson, go out and look at the universe that God has created, and look at all of its complexity and its functionality and its immensity, and behold the God who made all of that. So what it all boils down to is that we should all acknowledge God as Creator and Lord. He's the one. He's the ultimate ruler of the universe, and He's the one who created it. And more than that, it's not just simply giving mental assent to the idea that, well, yeah, there's a supreme being, but we ought to be really filled with stand in awe and wonder of Him, to realize that He knows us, that we're in a sense we're in His presence, and that we ultimately have to deal with Him. And given the fact that He's infinitely greater than we are, when we take a look at the things that He's created, we should basically back off and just stand and adore Him and worship Him in awe and wonder. And then, of course, that raises the question that's even a problem, I think, in a lot of modern churches. What does it mean to worship God in actual practice? And it should involve our humbling ourselves before God. When we gather together for a time of public worship, it shouldn't just be us, rapping to the music and shouting and raising our hands. But we should be conscious. We should consciously enter into the presence of God, and be conscious of how great and immense and enormous He is, and how holy He is. And we should humble ourselves before Him. We should reverently praise Him. We should humbly ask for His favor and His blessing, and listen attentively to His word being preached. I think it's kind of interesting. I've been a Christian for most of my life, life, and I'm now 75 years old now. I made a profession of faith like over 65 years ago. And I think that in that lifespan of time, there's only I can almost count the number of times when I actually felt the presence of God in a public worship on one hand. And what was strange about it, unusual about it, or unexpected about it, was that this hushed silence would fall over the whole group. You could hear a pin drop, because we're all conscious of being in the presence of a holy God, and we were all silenced before Him. And of course, if God really is our Creator, and we owe our very existence to Him, and He's infinitely greater to us, then we should devote our lives to serving Him. Okay? He deserves all of our love, attention, and devotion, and we should dedicate our lives to serving Him. We are His creatures. We are placed here on this earth to serve Him, and therefore we should try to fulfill His creative purposes in our lives. And I would even go so far as to say that we should be willing to suffer for His own name's sake. It's interesting when you look at this chapter in Isaiah chapter 40. It was written at the time when the Assyrians had come in and taken the northern kingdom of Israel captive, and had threatened the city of Jerusalem itself. And so people wondered, and it says at the end of the chapter, "Why do you say, O Jacob, and O speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my just claim is passed over by my God? Have you not known? Have you not heard? The everlasting God, the Lord, the Creator of the ends of the earth, neither faints nor is weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the weak, and to those who have no might He increases strength. Even the youth shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fall. But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. You shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not be afraid." So yes, even Christians, God brings through with difficult times. There are trials and temptations and hardships that we endure. But you want to keep in mind that God's ultimately in control. We need to wait patiently on Him and realize that He'll bring us through the present trials and difficulties we have, and that we can expect in future, when Christ returns, will far surpass any of the problems that we wind up suffering in this life right now. And therefore we should take heart and put our trust in God, the infinite God, and put our hope in Him. So I hope you enjoyed. We'll take all of that to heart. There's a great classic hymn about this that kind of says it better than I did, and that's this hymn, "How Great Thou Art," and I'll put a link on it to it down in the description. It's well worth taking the time to listen. So thanks for listening today, and we'll catch you later. Bye.